They thought I was a simple archivist burying my life in dust, but I was secretly engineering a fortune until my greedy family accidentally tipped off the very people I was trying to escape. The scent of burnt toast and stale coffee was the official fragrance of my life, or at least that's what my sister, Clarissa, always insisted. I could practically hear her voice echoing in my small, rent-controlled apartment whenever she visited, which was usually only when she needed to borrow $20. Honestly, Theo, she'd sigh, fanning herself dramatically with a discarded utility bill, look at this place. It smells like potential that gave up. I'd just smile, wiping down the already gleaming, decades-old Formica countertop. I worked at the city archive, sorting dusty deeds and microfiche. My uniform was always slightly rumpled tweed, and my weekends were spent tending to my minuscule balcony garden, nursing succulents that stubbornly refused to die. It was quiet. It was simple. And to my family, it was a profound disappointment. My parents, bless their striving, status-obsessed hearts, had built their entire identity around the illusion of upward mobility. They'd pushed me toward law school, then finance, seeing my meticulous nature as raw material for a six-figure salary. When I chose the municipal archives, a job that paid just enough to cover my meager existence and offered zero prestige, it was treated as a personal betrayal. "Your cousin, Marcus!" Dad would boom during Sunday dinners, the unspoken comparison hanging heavy in the air like smoke. "He just bought his third rental property." "Third? And what are you doing, Theo? Cataloging the forgotten parking violations of 1987? I never argued. Arguing required energy I preferred to spend elsewhere. I accepted the pitying glances, the gentle suggestions that I maybe look into something with better benefits, and the thinly veiled mockery from Clarissa, who was perpetually trying to climb the social ladder, one expensive handbag at a time. It wasn't that I didn't like nice things. I did. I just didn't need them. My desires were simple: good books, reliable plumbing, and uninterrupted silence. The world, particularly my immediate family, saw this as a moral failing, a lack of ambition. They assumed I was either lazy or pathologically simple. They didn't know about the early mornings, the pre-dawn hours spent hunched over flickering screens in the cool solitude of my apartment. They didn't know about the meticulous spreadsheets, the complex algorithms I'd developed in my spare time, fueled by nothing more than cheap black tea and an obsessive need to understand patterns. They thought I was happy clipping coupons. I was actually clipping coupons for the life I was secretly designing for myself, a life far beyond their comprehension. Last Tuesday, Clarissa stopped by unannounced, predictably furious because her new Italian leather sofa had arrived with a minuscule scratch. She needed my advice on litigation strategy, even though I hadn't practiced law since I dropped out of my first semester of undergrad 10 years ago. "I'm going to sue them for emotional distress, Theo. They need to feel the impact of this aesthetic damage," she declared, pacing my tiny living room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the worn linoleum. "You know, you should try suing for something, Theo. Get some traction. What's the biggest inconvenience you've dealt with lately? That leaking faucet?" I nodded vaguely, setting down the heavy ledger I was reviewing. "Something like that." "See?" she huffed, grabbing a lukewarm soda from my fridge. "You're too passive. You need to fight for what you deserve." She left shortly after, satisfied that she had imparted a day's worth of unwarranted financial wisdom. I waited until her expensive car was out of sight. Then I walked over to the back of my cramped coat closet. Behind a stack of moth-eaten winter coats, I pulled out a heavy, nondescript metal briefcase. It wasn't locked, just latched. I opened it, and the faint, cool luminescence of dozens of perfectly pressed, sequential $100 bills spilled out, not stacked high like a drug dealer's cash, but methodically arranged, organized by serial number, awaiting transfer. It was more money than my parents would earn in 10 combined lifetimes. I closed the case, the familiar weighty comfort settling back into my hands. The simple life was the perfect camouflage. No one ever looked closely at the quiet archivist. The next day, I received an encrypted message on my secure burner phone, the one I kept hidden inside the hollowed-out base of my oldest, dustiest dictionary. It was from Custodian Prime, the entity I had been dealing with for the last 5 years, the one who understood the true value of my quiet genius. The message was brief, 4 words. The final transfer is ready. My heart rate, usually as steady as the archival clock, actually picked up a beat. This was it. The culmination of the last 5 years of strategic, anonymous digital arbitrage. I had planned for this moment to the second. I leaned back against the cool metal of the filing cabinet, feeling the thrill of absolute hidden victory. The plan was flawless. I was about to walk away from the burnt toast and the pitying glances forever. But as I looked down at the message again, a tiny, almost invisible addendum flashed beneath the main text, a line of code I hadn't anticipated, a variable I hadn't accounted for in my perfectly controlled simulation. P.S. We require 1 piece of physical collateral upon receipt of funds. It must be delivered to the drop point by midnight tomorrow, or the entire transaction reverses. My blood ran cold. Collateral? I had accounted for everything: taxes, jurisdictional hurdles, digital footprints, but a physical requirement? I frantically scrolled back through our months of secure communication, but there was no mention of this. And then I realized what that single, final requirement could only refer to. They wanted the one thing I had sworn never to give up, the very core of my secret identity, my original handwritten decryption key, the one I kept hidden inside the only truly valuable object I owned. I had to retrieve it from its most secure location, a place I hadn't accessed in years, a place my family knew about and often mocked. And as I looked up, suddenly feeling the walls of the quiet archive closing in, I remembered exactly where my parents had last seen me hide that worthless trinket 2 years ago, shortly before they'd pawned some of my old possessions to pay for Clarissa's ill-advised cruise. The dusty, seldom-used safety deposit box at the First National Trust, the box they thought was still empty. The blood, which had rushed away from my head so quickly it left a cold, ringing silence in its wake, began to return with a pounding thud against my eardrums. The final transfer. 5 years of meticulous, exhausting, solitary work, all hinging on a single, unexpected physical requirement. Collateral. The original key. It wasn't just a sequence of letters and numbers, it was a physical object, an antique brass locket engraved with a meaningless, complex knot pattern. I designed it to look like a meaningless family heirloom, something my grandmother might have owned, and then painstakingly hollowed it out to house the microscopic memory chip containing the initial seed phrases for my entire digital empire. If that key fell into the wrong hands, Custodian Prime wouldn't just reverse the funds. They'd own the entire operation. My immediate problem wasn't Custodian Prime. It was my family. They knew about the box at First National. They thought the key was still there. a sentimental, useless artifact I'd forgotten about. 2 years ago, during a massive collective family emergency, Dad's misguided investment in a chain of artisanal pickle kiosks collapsing spectacularly. They had needed quick, untraceable cash. They'd ransacked the old box looking for anything sellable, and I had only managed to stop them from destroying the locket by claiming it held the only remaining photograph of my late Aunt Beatrice, a woman Dad deeply feared the memory of. They had taken everything else of mild value, but they'd left the locket, deeming it too sentimental and, frankly, worthless. But the message demanded delivery by midnight tomorrow, and I had to get the key out of that box before my parents decided to check on it again, perhaps needing another small infusion of capital to cover Clarissa's latest impulse purchase of a rare, temperamental orchid. I had less than 30 hours. I walked out of the archive building at 5 o'clock, but instead of heading toward my quiet apartment, I caught the downtown express train, the one that ran directly past the sprawling, manicured grounds of my parents' suburban McMansion. I needed to establish an alibi of normalcy, and perhaps, more importantly, I needed to gauge the current situation at the family home. The air inside their house was always thick with manufactured anxiety. Tonight was no different. My mother was on the phone, her voice pitched high, discussing the supposed poor quality of the imported granite in the pool house remodel. "It chips if you look at it wrong, Helen. Honestly, the quality control these days." Dad was polishing his golf trophies, an act of meditative aggression he performed whenever he felt financially precarious. Clarissa, predictably, was there too, draped over the leather sofa, complaining about a Wi-Fi dead spot in the West Wing. I approached them cautiously. "Hello, everyone. Just stopping by to see if you needed anything." The sudden appearance of the simple son always caused a brief, awkward silence. "Theo," Mom said, lowering the phone slightly, "we're fine. Are you sure you don't want to stay for dinner? We have salmon, though I suspect it was farmed, not wild caught." "No, I can't," I said, injecting a note of rushed exhaustion into my voice. "I actually have to handle something. Urgent. A big project at the archive is due." "Urgent?" Clarissa snorted, not looking up from her phone. Did the microfiche machine finally jam for the first time in 30 years? "Something like that," I confirmed smoothly. "Look, I actually just remembered. I left something critically important at the bank the other day. I need to retrieve it tonight before they close early for some internal merger thing." This caught their attention. Money and institutions were their touchstones. Dad stopped polishing. "The bank? Which one? First National? They've been weird lately. High security checks." "Yes, First National," I confirmed, my voice carefully neutral. "It's my safety deposit box. I just need to access something before they lock down for the weekend." I needed them to believe I was accessing my things, not confronting their potential intrusion into my hidden assets. Mom frowned, her anxiety spiking slightly. "Are you sure you should be accessing that now, Theo? We really need to discuss that box next month. We thought we might use it to store the new insurance papers, just to keep them somewhere safe and centralized." The trap was sprung. They hadn't forgotten it. They were actively planning to raid it again. "Absolutely not," I said, perhaps too sharply, forcing myself to backtrack instantly. "It's highly confidential. It contains certain, proprietary archival material that I can't risk having near any residential exposure. Humidity, you know." Dad seemed satisfied by the official-sounding jargon. "Archival material, right. Well, don't be late for the bank then. Security is no joke." I left quickly, the weight of the briefcase feeling suddenly heavier, a beacon advertising my secret. I had bought myself a few hours of clear sailing until they inevitably decided to help me manage this urgent archival material. The bank lobby was almost deserted. The guard gave me a cursory nod, recognizing the predictable drone of the simple archivist performing his mundane tasks. I signed the ledger, my hand steady despite the internal earthquake, and was escorted down to the vault level. The massive steel door hissed open, revealing rows of dark metal lockers. My box, 412B, was located near the back corner. The vault attendant slid the heavy drawer out. I took the heavy brass key that had been on my desk drawer, a perfect decoy, and inserted it into the lock. It clicked open. I reached inside, my fingers brushing past the heavy, familiar coldness of the locket resting against the felt lining. I pulled it out, sliding the tiny, intricate knot in my palm. But as I turned to hand the key back to the attendant, I caught a reflection in the polished steel wall opposite me. It wasn't the attendant. It was a figure standing just beyond the vault entrance, partially obscured by the shadow of the doorframe, watching me with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. They weren't supposed to be here. They weren't supposed to know about the box. The figure stepped slightly forward, and in the dim, sterile light of the vault, I saw not my parents, but a stark, tailored suit and a face utterly devoid of warmth. A face I had only ever seen in highly secured digital portraits. It was Custodian Prime's fixer, the enforcer, and he was holding up a heavy, black, secure mobile device displaying a live timer counting down from T-minus 23 hours and 58 minutes. Beneath the timer, in glowing red text, was the word, now. The air in the vault dropped 10 degrees. My breath hitched, a shallow, useless gasp in the heavily filtered, climate-controlled atmosphere. The fixer, I knew instantly he wasn't just an errand boy. He was the operational muscle. Didn't smile, didn't gesture. He merely held up the phone, the red timer ticking down with merciless accuracy, confirming that the final transfer wasn't a symbolic endpoint. It was an immediate, critical exchange that my family's interference had dangerously stalled. Mr. Thorne. The fixer's voice was smooth, synthesized like a high-end GPS system speaking a threat. We had an agreement. Physical exchange at point of completion. We move the capital. You secure the encryption. My mind raced, firing off contingency plans that had only ever existed as theoretical exercises. I had needed to secure the locket before I could initiate the final sequence on my end, a necessary buffer against network failure. But his presence here meant they had moved their timeline forward, bypassing the 24-hour grace period I had banked on. They were forcing the handoff now in a public-adjacent space. This is unexpected, I managed, forcing my voice into the controlled, slightly monotonous tone I used when fielding fussy calls about misplaced municipal documents. I clutched the locket tighter, the brass digging painfully into my palm. Market volatility demands immediacy, Mr. Thorne. You understand volatility better than anyone. He glanced pointedly at the briefcase lying innocently on the counter beside the open deposit box. The funds are confirmed ready on our end. Do you possess the collateral? I knew I couldn't initiate the final transfer without that key in my secure possession after the funds were confirmed irreversible in my own deep layer accounts. If I handed over the locket now and the transfer failed for any reason, a lag, a server hiccup, I would be left with nothing, exposed and compromised. But if I refused, Custodian Prime would vaporize my accounts, and likely my digital existence along with them. "The collateral is secured," I confirmed, nodding toward the briefcase, the ultimate bluff. "But protocol dictates the transfer must be validated before physical exchange. I need the authentication confirmation on my terminal before I relinquish the key." The fixer tilted his head, a purely predatory gesture. "Our validation process is simpler, Mr. Thorne. We trust your reputation for precision, or we unravel your assets. Your choice." He took a slow, deliberate step into the vault chamber, his presence immediately making the space feel claustrophobic. The attendant, sensing the sudden, sharp shift in atmosphere, visibly swallowed and retreated several feet, pretending to dust a shelf near the entrance. I had seconds. If I ran, I'd be stopped, detained, or worse, physically subdued before I even reached the lobby. If I complied, I'd lose everything. My eyes flickered from the ticking phone to the heavy briefcase. The briefcase contained the liquid assets, the untraceable cash, the emergency fund, the fallback, the resources to disappear if the primary plan failed. It was the only thing I could afford to lose right now, provided I kept the locket. "Very well," I said, nodding slowly, signaling agreement to his terms, even as I plotted betrayal. I reached for the briefcase. Authentication first. I opened the latch, pulling out a carefully selected stack, about $200,000 worth, enough to look substantial but not enough to trigger immediate alarm if they examined it closely. I slid the bundle across the steel counter toward him. He didn't touch it. His eyes remained locked on the locket in my other hand. "The key, Thorne." I made my move. Instead of dropping the locket into his waiting hand, I used the motion to slide the briefcase forward, simultaneously kicking the heavy steel drawer of the open deposit box violently shut. The sound was deafening, a deep metallic thwump that echoed in the vault. The fixer flinched, momentarily distracted by the noise and the sudden movement. That was all the time I needed. I didn't try to run out of the vault. I pivoted toward the rear wall of the deposit area, right where the main, heavily reinforced ventilation shaft was located, a spot I had extensively mapped during my early archival reconnaissance missions, noting the specific thickness of the surrounding concrete. I slammed the heavy brass locket, the one containing the actual digital key, hard against the concrete wall, right next to the access panel for the ventilation unit. The ancient metal cracked under the impact, not breaking the locket entirely, but forcing the delicate seam to pop open slightly, exposing the microchip within. "Don't be foolish, Thorne," the fixer snarled, finally moving, his hand going inside his tailored jacket. I ignored him, pulling out my pocket multi-tool, the cheap one I used for fixing loose cabinet handles. I jammed the thin metal pick into the exposed seam of the locket. There was a tiny, almost inaudible hiss as I dislodged the chip, grabbing the minuscule iridescent sliver of silicon with a pair of tweezers kept handy in my coat pocket. I didn't insert the chip into my secure phone. Instead, I threw the broken brass shell, now containing nothing but air and wood filler, across the room, directly at the fixer's face. He batted it away instinctively. "That is not the key," he roared, realizing the deception. "Correct," I gasped, backing up against the far wall as the attendant finally fumbled for a silent alarm button. That was the decoy. I jammed the real microchip into the emergency data port on the external casing of the main ventilation unit, a port I had installed 3 years ago under the guise of routine electrical inspection during a midnight audit. The red timer on the fixer's phone vanished. It was replaced by a single flashing green notification on the ventilation unit's small external panel. "Transfer complete. Seed release authorized." Victory tasted metallic, sharp, and momentary. I had the money secured in deep, untraceable layers. The fixer pulled out his own weapon, not a gun, but a sophisticated-looking electronic disruptor, and leveled it at me. "You have just voided your entire existence, Thorne. We own the keys now and we know where you live." Before he could press the activation stud, the vault door mechanism shrieked in protest. It wasn't the attendant. It was the bank manager, alerted by the sudden, sharp noise of the locked drawer slamming shut. The massive steel door began to grind slowly closed, plunging the vault into near darkness, trapping the fixer inside with the evidence of his failed mission and the useless stack of cash I'd offered him. I scrambled back toward the outer access door, clutching the microchip and the heavy briefcase. I made it out of the vault area and sprinted into the deserted main lobby, just as the emergency lock sequence finished, sealing the vault area with a final resounding clang. I burst onto the street, gulping the cool night air, expecting sirens, expecting pursuit. Nothing. They couldn't pursue me openly. Their entire operation depended on absolute secrecy. They had to deal with the fixer and the missing chip internally. I hailed a cab, shoving the briefcase onto the seat beside me. I was safe, rich beyond measure, and finally, free. I leaned back, pulling out my burner phone to confirm the final account status. The screen flickered to life. My primary account balance was indeed zeroed out. As expected, having successfully been transferred to my untraceable ghost ledger. But then, a secondary alert popped up, one that made my carefully constructed composure shatter into a million icy pieces. It wasn't from Custodian Prime. It was an automated security alert from my own apartment complex. Emergency access. Alert Apartment 3B, my simple, quiet sanctuary, the perfect camouflage, had been breached. And the message wasn't coming from a system malfunction. It was an SMS notification sent from my personal security app, signed with a name that instantly froze the blood in my veins. Mom. "We found your secret closet, Theo. Clarissa needed some new handbags. We're waiting." The cab driver, blissfully unaware he was transporting a newly minted, highly endangered millionaire, asked cheerfully, "Where to, boss? You look like you just saw a ghost." I couldn't answer. The name Mom flashing on the screen, paired with the chilling context, "Clarissa needed new handbags," was infinitely more terrifying than the suited operative trapped in the bank vault. Custodian Prime operated by clear, if ruthless, rules. My parents operated on impulse, entitlement, and a profound inability to leave well enough alone. They hadn't just found the closet, they had found the secondary, meticulously hidden safe. The one I had built after they'd last rifled through my things. The one disguised as a structural ventilation access panel inside the back of my coat storage unit. It was meant to hold the last 3 years of physical documentation, the only hard copies of my initial investment theses. I barked the address of my apartment complex at the driver, slapping a crumpled $100 bill onto the seat. Drive. Now. The 5-mile ride felt like an eternity of slow-motion horror. My mind played the scenario on repeat. Mom, sensing opportunity. Clarissa, driven by materialistic hunger. Dad, perhaps attempting to exert paternal authority over something he couldn't understand. They wouldn't be gentle. They would take everything that looked valuable. And in my carefully curated world of deceptive simplicity, nearly everything in that apartment was a meticulously designed trap or a highly sensitive asset. If they found the physical documents, they wouldn't just see investment strategies. They'd see the intricate web of shell corporations, the encrypted keys to offshore accounts that were supposed to be dormant for another decade. They would expose me not just to the digital underworld I'd just escaped, but to actual, tangible federal scrutiny. We screeched to a halt outside my complex. I didn't wait for change. I sprinted up the 3 flights of stairs, the heavy briefcase thudding painfully against my hip. I fumbled with my keys at the door, my fingers slick with adrenaline. The lock turned with agonizing ease. The apartment wasn't chaotic, it was organized destruction. The scene was surgically clean, betraying a frightening efficiency. The cheap bookshelf, my disguise for a false wall, had been pulled away. The floorboards where I kept my emergency physical keys to my real escape funds were already pried up, the small specialized toolkit I used lying discarded nearby. My mother stood near the center of the room, radiating a terrifying, self-righteous calm. Clarissa was perched on my threadbare armchair, already holding a small, leather-bound ledger, the one containing the finalized exit strategy notes, annotated in my own hand. "Theo, you're home," Mom said, sounding almost pleased, as if I'd returned from a long shift at the library. "We were just tidying up a bit. You live so sparsely, dear, it's really quite sad. We thought we'd find some better jewelry, perhaps some antique silver, but this—" She gestured vaguely at the scattered papers. Clarissa flipped the ledger open, her eyes widening as she hit a page detailing the liquidation schedule for an asset portfolio valued in the tens of millions. "Oh my God, Theo," Clarissa breathed, her voice shaking with avarice. "What is this? This isn't about parking violations. This is real money." "Put that down," I said, my voice low and stripped of all previous civility. The simple archivist was dead. Only the survivor remained. My parents exchanged a look, the look that said, "He's finally snapped, but look at the potential payoff." "Don't use that tone with your mother, Theodore," Dad boomed from the kitchen doorway, where he was presumably inspecting the integrity of my cheap refrigerator. "We were merely trying to help you consolidate. We noticed you had some very interesting documents." "You violated the one rule," I whispered, walking slowly toward Clarissa, who was still mesmerized by the numbers. "The one sacred boundary." "Sacred boundary?" Clarissa scoffed, finally looking up, the ledger still gripped tight. "This is bankruptcy protection, Theo. We're saving you. We're seeing what you've been hiding. You think you're better than us because you live like a pauper? Well, now we know the truth. You're just a late-blooming hoarder of wealth." I reached her in 2 quick strides. I didn't grab for the ledger. Instead, I spun the handle of the briefcase, the one holding the $200,000 decoy cash, and swung it hard, aiming for the side of her head. The heavy leather connected with a sickening thwack. Clarissa collapsed instantly, the ledger flying from her grasp and skidding across the wooden floor, landing near my feet. Chaos erupted. Dad roared and lunged toward me from the kitchen. Mom shrieked, her carefully constructed composure finally shattering. I kicked the briefcase toward my parents, a momentary distraction, and dropped to one knee, snatching up the ledger. I flipped it open to the final page, my only thought to destroy the physical evidence of my identity here. As I brought my lighter to the page, ready to incinerate the damning proof, a new sound cut through the din of my parents' panic. The whine of rapidly approaching sirens, too close for a standard police response. They were local. They were fast. I froze, lighter halfway to the paper. I hadn't called them. Custodian Prime wouldn't call the police. The fixer was still locked in the bank vault. Who had called the authorities? Then I saw it. Tucked under the edge of the open ledger, sticking out just enough to catch the light, was a small laminated card. It wasn't mine. It was a laminated press pass bearing the logo of a major aggressive financial news outlet, the kind that specialized in high-profile fraud raids. And lying beside the card was a disposable cell phone, already recording video, angled perfectly toward the scene of domestic carnage, the downed sister, and the frantic man trying to burn documents. The siren volume peaked right outside the building. Someone hadn't just found my secret, they had broadcast it. I realized, with chilling certainty, that the person who had alerted the media wasn't Custodian Prime, and it wasn't my panicked family. It was the one person I had successfully alienated and underestimated more than anyone else in my life. The one person with the motive, the access, and the sheer pettiness to orchestrate this perfect public implosion. As the heavy boots pounded up the exterior staircase, I stared at the phone recording the scene, the screen reflecting the sudden, horrified realization dawning on my mother's face. The identity of the informant was confirmed when I heard the loud, triumphant gasp from the hallway just before the door splintered open. Not police, but a familiar, mocking voice. "Took you long enough to realize, Theo. I told you to fight for what you deserve." It was Clarissa, miraculously awake, leaning heavily against the doorframe, holding up her own phone, which displayed a live feed of her initial blurry footage. Footage she had clearly taken before I hit her with the briefcase. "And look, I got the money, too. The whole family's gonna be rich." The splintering wood of the doorframe announced the arrival of the cavalry, but it wasn't the authorities I feared. It was Clarissa, standing upright, her hand pressed theatrically to her temple, the predator mask replaced by one of triumphant, calculated innocence. She hadn't been knocked unconscious, she'd been staging. My parents, caught between their panicked greed and the sudden, terrifying arrival of blinding camera flashes and shouted questions from the media scrum pouring into the hallway, froze like statues. They had stumbled into a financial crime scene orchestrated by their own scheming daughter. I knew in that searing moment that the fight for my digital fortune was over. Custodian Prime had failed to secure the key physically, but Clarissa, with her relentless need for social capital and her innate ability to weaponize gossip, had just succeeded in destroying my anonymity, which was the true cornerstone of my entire operation. I didn't look at my parents' devastated faces or the flashing lights. I looked down at the burning page in my hand, the fire licking hungrily at the ledger detailing the escape plan. The funds were safe, locked away in the deep, untouchable network. But the key, the physical locket shell containing the actual chip, was gone, shattered in the vault. The real key, the minuscule sliver of silicon, was still clutched in my tweezers. "It's all a misunderstanding," Mom wailed, trying to shield the decimated bookshelf from the cameras. "My son works at the city archive. He's just disorganized." "Disorganized with $20 million, Mrs. Thorne?" A voice boomed from the entryway, belonging to a relentless-looking journalist. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the shock recede and the cold, strategic logic of the archivist return. I had lost the element of surprise, but I still controlled the narrative of my actions. I tossed the burning ledger page onto the floor near the crumpled briefcase, making sure the flames caught the remaining cash bundle. Then I slowly raised my hands in surrender, not toward the shouting reporters, but toward the nearest camera lens, establishing visual contact. "My name is Theodore Thorne," I said clearly, my voice cutting through the noise, perfectly modulated, just as it was when presenting complex findings to the city council. "I am an employee of the municipal archive, and this is not a financial raid. This is a family dispute over inherited property that has been grossly misrepresented." I stepped deliberately over the fallen Clarissa, careful to avoid the briefcase as if it were contaminated. My sister, Clarissa, suffering from delusions of grandeur and severe consumer debt, has fabricated evidence to suggest that my modest savings accumulated from years of meticulous anonymous investment in undervalued municipal bonds, are the proceeds of illegal activity. The media loved the word bonds. It sounded legitimate, boring, and therefore, ironically, scandalous coming from a man who lived on instant ramen. The ledger she burned, I continued, pointing to the ashes, contained proof of my investment strategies, which I developed in my downtime, strategies based entirely on historical trends I observed in public records. I met the lens again. If you look at the records of the First National Trust, you will see that all large transactions cleared before I left the bank tonight. I was not withdrawing illegal funds. I was initiating a legal, quiet retirement plan. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. I conceded the money, which was already layered into an untouchable digital fortress, and framed it as boring, legal portfolio growth. I implicated Clarissa's malice, turning her greed into her undoing. The police, arriving moments later, found a scene of domestic battery. Clarissa was nursing a very real lump thanks to my timely swing. Financial documents actively being destroyed by the supposed suspect, and a distraught mother claiming her son had snapped from the stress of filing zoning permits. My parents were taken in for questioning regarding the break-in and the destruction of property. Clarissa, realizing her carefully staged footage would now show her attacking me after the initial staged footage, was too disoriented to effectively lie to the police. They were released hours later, facing trespassing charges and a lifetime of family shame, completely cut off from my actual fortune. I walked out of the precinct at 4 a.m., signing a statement that acknowledged only a psychological break related to work stress and agreeing to voluntary counseling. The briefcase containing the $200,000 was confiscated as evidence of an unstable individual's assets. A small price to pay. My apartment was condemned for the night due to structural damage, but I didn't care. I hailed another cab heading not back toward the burnout remnants of my simple life, but toward a secured, anonymous location I'd pre-booked 6 months ago under an alias. In my hand, I still held the tiny microchip, the true collateral. Custodian Prime was still out there, waiting for me to make the next move, but I had the key, and I had the capital. As the taxi crossed the city limits, leaving the suburbs and the ensuing media circus behind, I opened my burner phone one last time. I didn't contact Custodian Prime. Instead, I opened a file I had created years ago, labeled Future Ambitions. It contained a single complex directive, designed for the moment the original plan collapsed. I typed out a single instruction to my network of ghost servers, setting the final, irrevocable command: initiate Phase 2. Phase 2 was never about easy money. It was about leverage. It was about building something so vast, so complex, that no single entity, no ruthless digital broker, no status-obsessed family, no ambitious sister, could ever threaten its existence again. I looked out at the dawn breaking over the unfamiliar, open road. My simple life was over. The next one would be entirely invisible. And I smiled, the genuine, unburdened smile of a man who had just executed the most expensive, satisfying act of rebellion imaginable. I had lost the appearance of poverty, but I had finally secured true wealth, absolute, untouchable solitude. I closed my eyes, already planning my next move against the shadowy organization that thought they could dictate terms to the man who understood the pattern of everything.